Russia has an atmosphere unlike any other place around the world. Strangely, so much of it remains unknown to the city tourist. When you've seen some of the spectacular attractions that could be found in its huge sprawling capital, however, you'll realise why Moscow is a city that just demands to be visited, and has recently become one of the most sought-out destinations on the tourist trail. With its glorious combination of ornate churches, monumental sculptures and the towering edifices of the communist era, this really has become a spectacular city of contrasts which cannot fail to capture the hearts of all those who venture through its bustling streets. As we explore a magnificent array of architectural wonders, in this portrait of a city, we'll embark upon an intriguing journey into Moscow's past, from its medieval beginnings to the turmoil of the 20th century. And along the way, we'll find out how this extraordinary capital city has evolved and flourished to become a favourite holiday destination. The first reference to Moscow dates back to the 12th century, when the city's founder, Prince Yuri Dolgoruki, built a wooden fortress on the banks of the river Moskva to surround the growing settlement. Almost 900 years later, a vast fortress, or in Russian, Kremlin, still stands near the site of the prince's original wooden structure. And here at the Kremlin, in the very heart of the city, we'll begin our tour of Moscow. This site has always been the citadel of Russia's past Tsars, and now Russia's current president also resides within these walls, which makes it easy to see why the Kremlin has shaped so much of Moscow's past and present landscape. Over the years, there have been many improvements to the protective Kremlin, but it was during the reign of Ivan III when the most elaborate developments took place. The Grand Prince of Moscow invited architects from Renaissance Italy to construct a palace and great cathedrals within the fortress, and in 1485 work began on new walls and towers for the complex. Although originally meant to protect the wonderful buildings inside the Kremlin, the imposing red wall created in the Middle Ages would become symbolic of the control and secrecy that surrounded the workings of Moscow in the 20th century. As you walk around the outside, you can't help but get a slight chill as the red brick wall towers above you. It wasn't until 1991, with the fall of the so-called Iron Curtain, that the public were allowed to venture inside. Thankfully, today, the doors to many of the buildings of the spectacular complex are open for public viewing. One of the main entrances that tourists take to get into the Kremlin is the Trinity Tower, and of all the entrance gates, at over 249 feet tall, this is the most impressive. Once you walk through its huge arch, there's a whole host of delights ready to be explored within the fortress's walls. From the magnificent Kremlin Palace to an array of golden domed cathedrals and splendid churches. There's also plenty to see outside the looming walls of the Kremlin, however, and should you explore the eastern side of the complex, you'll find another of Moscow's most iconic attractions. When Ivan III had completed his work on the Kremlin, he decreed that no structures should be built within the immediate vicinity of the citadel, and an area once filled with houses was cleared to create a huge state square. The Red Square is now regarded as the centre of the city, and has become an important centre for parades, concerts, and other public events. Years ago, it was also an important trade centre, filled with shops and stalls, and at times there were even executions here. At the southeastern end of the square, you'll also find the very platform used by so many of Russia's past leaders to make their historical speeches, the Lobno Mesto. This small, circular stone platform is also the perfect spot to take in the majesty of Red Square. And from here, you can really begin to explore the many wonderful buildings that surround the area. Every one of these beautiful buildings has a different story to tell. However, none is more beautiful than St. Basil's Cathedral. Russia's Tsar Ivan IV, otherwise known as Ivan the Terrible, ordered its construction in 1555 to commemorate his victory over the Mongol Tartars. Legend has it that the Tsar was so pleased with the building when it was completed that he had the architect Postnik Yakovlev blinded to prevent him from ever designing anything to equal its magnificence. Ivan may have gone a little too far to ensure that nothing quite like it was ever built again, but he was not wrong in recognizing how truly remarkable this religious structure is. With its brightly coloured towers and onion domes, St. Basil's Cathedral is possibly the finest example of Russian Baroque architecture in Moscow, and standing pride of place overlooking the Red Square sums up the individual character of this intriguing city. There are still, however, plenty of attractions to see here, and you only have to turn around and look across to the other end of the square, and you'll see yet another world-class building just itching to be explored. This huge red structure, which towers over the bustling tourists, is the State Historical Museum. Originally opened in 1894, the museum's neo-Russian design is one of the city's finest examples of this kind of architecture. Even today, the red brick facade with its ornate turrets, pinnacles and decorative cornices leaves a lingering imprint on the mind. Thanks to the effort of Russian scientists, historians and archaeologists, the museum's collection of artifacts is so huge that the numbers have now reached well over 4 million. Inside, you can explore all aspects of Russian history, from its ancient tribal beginnings right up to the present day. And there are some fascinating treasures to see, such as the silver death mask of Peter the Great, who transformed the Russian Tsardom into an empire in the 18th century. If you enjoy delving into Russian history, there's one final building in the square which is probably the most intriguing of all. Behind the red brick walls of this rather plain structure lie the remains of one of the former Soviet Union's most famous leaders, Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was a revolutionary and a communist politician and the main leader of the October Revolution that marked the end of the old Tsarist Empire, bringing about the birth of the first communist state and the Soviet Union. After he died on January the 21st, 1924, many Russians urged the government to preserve his body. Despite his wish not to have any memorial, his remains were preserved and placed inside this building. The system of embalming perfectly preserved his body, and now he lies in his mausoleum on constant display in what looks like a state of never-ending sleep. Behind the mausoleum, you'll also find the graves of other famous communists, such as Yuri Andropov and Joseph Stalin, whose bodies now lie beneath the towering walls of the Kremlin. Incredibly, this is still only the beginning of a remarkable journey through Moscow's past, and the next few places to visit grace the skyline with some very splendid and perhaps more modern buildings than the ones you've seen so far. In fact, these are not just a few places to explore, but 7 superb sites which are spread out around southwest Moscow. This collection of buildings goes by the name of the Seven Sisters, and when you see them up close, you'll quickly understand why people think they're related. All these buildings were created after the Second World War, and were the brainchild of the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. He had great plans for what he called a Palace of Soviets, and and the Seven Sisters were just the start of his redesign of Moscow, which would include the phenomenal metro system and a soaring tower topped by a 328-foot statue of Lenin. The tower with Lenin was never completed, however the Seven Sisters were, and are now the signature buildings of what is known as the Stalinist Gothic style. One of the finest examples of this collection is the Moscow State University, situated just north of the Kremlin, which is actually the tallest educational building in the world. With its Soviet star perched on top and classic wedding cake style towers, there's no mistaking that this is one of Stalin's buildings. The Moscow State University wouldn't look out of place in any modern metropolitan city, and this is exactly what Stalin wanted, as after the war he feared foreigners would come to Moscow and be astonished by the lack of skyscrapers. With the creation of this building and 6 others, Stalin wanted to show the world the power and influence the Soviet Union now had. Another fine example of one of Stalin's Seven Sisters is the Foreign Ministry, which you'll discover if you walk to the western end of the city centre. The building looms high above the streets of the old Arbat District, and just like its siblings, demonstrates beautifully Stalin's vision for the new Soviet Union. The Foreign Ministry was one of the last buildings that Stalin overlooked before his death, and although his Palace of Soviets was never fully completed, what does remain makes up part of a stunning legacy. Stalin was also responsible for Moscow's metro system, which is one of the world's most famous underground networks. Since opening in 1935, it has always been at the forefront of design and usability. And to reach the next stop in our tour of Moscow, we'll need to venture a little further afield on the famous metro as we explore some more of the city's most impressive architectural treasures. We've already seen many of Moscow's most iconic attractions, but one of the most beautiful and most popular places to see if you come to the Russian capital is the Novodevichy Convent. Originally founded in 1524 by Basil III, this lovely building was built to commemorate the capture of the western Russian city of Smolensk from the Lithuanians. Understandably, many people now regard this as one of the most beautifully fortified religious institutions in all of Moscow, and with its ornately decorated walls and glorious towers, it creates a truly spectacular commemoratory building. Although the Communist Soviet Union closed the convent down in the 1920s, 2 decades later it was returned to its rightful owners, and today, hidden within, you can still find a fully working convent. It would have been quite a tragedy if the convent had been allowed to fall into disrepair, as gazing up at the tall towers and golden domes reaching high above the trees, it creates a stunningly captivating sight. You could probably be quite content just relaxing in the presence of this tranquil complex for the rest of the programme, as it's a place where all worldly stresses seem to just melt away. But as with many more places to visit, it's time to jump back onto the metro and head back into the city. Just a quick trip will take you back to the old Arbat District, which is a charming area in the west of Moscow. It has a totally different atmosphere to the Novodevichy Convent, yet you'll find it just as inviting. Very much like Covent Garden in London or Montmartre in Paris, the old Arbat is an area alive with bustling shoppers, stalls and street artists. And just as in similar areas around the world, this was where the writers, poets, artists and intellectuals of the city once lived and worked. If you have time, you may like to delve a little deeper into the fascinating history of this area. And as many of the houses here once belonged to some of the most cultured residents in Moscow, you'll find an array of interesting museums to explore. The most famous, and surely the most intriguing of these, would be the home of the great Russian author and poet Alexander Pushkin. With its striking white and blue facade, there's no mistaking this museum, as Pushkin's house is probably one of the least Russian-looking buildings in Moscow, and wouldn't look out of place in a fine Georgian street in London. However, this is Moscow, and although the architecture is not classically Russian, the experience really is. Pushkin rented this elegant house in the 19th century and lived here with his new bride, Natalia Goncharova, one of the most talked about beauties in Moscow at the time. Sadly, the marriage didn't end happily. Pushkin discovered his beautiful wife had a lover, and after challenging his competitor to a duel, was fatally wounded in 1837. Nevertheless, the spirit of Pushkin is kept alive within these colourful walls, and the house pays true homage to the life and works of the talented writer. Travelling back towards the River Moskva and leaving Pushkin and the colourful streets of Old Arbat behind will take us to another of the city's most impressive landmarks. And while Pushkin's house is fascinating to explore, the architecture of this building will really take your breath away. Just a few blocks west of the Kremlin stands the stunning white and gold Christ the Saviour Cathedral, outshining everything else around, and the sparkling golden domes that reach high into the sky help to make this the tallest Eastern Orthodox church in the world. This is in fact a very new church, which was built to replace the original, which was destroyed in 1931 by Joseph Stalin. The Soviet dictator had chosen this spot to be the place where a great monument to socialism would be erected. So he blew up the old cathedral to make way for it. Due to the outbreak of war and then lack of funds, the work on the new monument was never started. And finally, in the 1990s, it was decided that the cathedral should be rebuilt. As we can see, the designers and builders worked extremely hard to create this truly astonishing building, which has succeeded in outshining the original by far. Architecture such as this is unlike anything else you'll find around the world. And if you're a fan of intriguing buildings and lavish design, then Moscow is a must, and Christ the Saviour Cathedral really does prove this point perfectly. Although the cathedral is perhaps one of the most beautiful buildings in this area of the city, there's one monument along the river competing for attention, which you'll find almost impossible to miss. This towering homage to Peter the Great utterly dominates the skyline, and at nearly 100 metres, this immense piece of art is one of the tallest statues in the world. It was created by the controversial artist Zurab Tsereteli in 1997 to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Russian Navy. However, the attitude of Muscovites to the statue is far from favourable, and some have gone to the most extraordinary extremes to remove the colossal bronze ship and Tsar from the cityscape, even attempting to blow it up. As well as complaints about the sheer size of the statue competing with the other buildings along the river, many are critical of its presence in a city which Peter the Great, the founder of St. Petersburg, was famed to hate. If you'd rather visit something a little closer to the hearts of the Muscovites, it's worth heading off to Moscow's best museums to uncover some of the city's hidden gems. One of the finest museums in the city is without doubt the Pushkin Museum of Fine Art, which can be found just opposite the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour on Volkhonka Street. Originally founded at the end of the 19th century, there really is no missing the museum's beautiful pillars and sweeping driveway. What is housed inside is just as unforgettable. The Pushkin Museum is home to Moscow's largest collection of European art, and was the idea of Professor Ivan Zvetaev, who persuaded the young millionaire Yuri Maltsov and the talented architect Roman Klein of the urgent need to give Moscow a world-class art museum. Tsvetaev must have been a persuasive man, as by 1898 plans for a lavish art museum were underway, and the combined efforts of Maltsov and Klein succeeded in creating this fabulous building, which was finally completed 14 years later. If you step inside, you can explore an array of delights from Roman, Greek and Byzantine antiquities to Gothic and Renaissance works, and a whole host of other masterpieces by world-famous artists such as Rembrandt and Van Gogh, among many others. You may, however, be a well-seasoned traveller who's seen a great deal of worldly masterpieces, and if this is the case, you might prefer to enjoy some more of Moscow's outdoor pleasures. Somewhere that displays this perfectly is the world-famous Gorky Park. This extraordinary area was originally opened in 1928, and it brought together two existing open spaces in order to create a huge 300-acre site that sits right on the banks of the Moskva. The two parks that melded to create Gorky were the Golitsyn Gardens and a later 19th century pleasure park. Because of the two very different types of park that went into making Gorky, it meant that it had the best of both worlds: entertainment and rides for the children, and wooded walks and floral borders for the adults. It's a wonderful place to spend a few hours of your time while in Moscow. From the impressive entrance gates to the original Buran spacecraft, Gorky Park has something for everyone, and even in the bitterly cold winter months provides a pleasant space inside the city for the public to enjoy. Many people have preconceptions of what they think Moscow is going to be like. But as you must have found on this fascinating tour of the city, one of the wonderful things about the Russian capital is that it's quite impossible to sum up in a few words. As this intriguing adventure nears its end, wandering along the River Moskva will give you the chance to take in your final views of this spellbinding city. From these banks, you can catch a last glimpse of unforgettable sights such as the Kremlin, Christ the Saviour Church, and Gorky Park. Taking a stroll along the river is a truly wonderful way to finish this fabulous journey through Russia's magnificent capital. This is the one true city in the world which is sure to leave you speechless, for its history, architecture and atmosphere blend together to make it a place unlike any other. Years, it has totally reinvented itself, and the mark that history has made on its streets and squares is undeniable. From an empire of tsars to a city hidden behind the Iron Curtain, a unique and extraordinary capital has been created, full of breathtaking wonders just waiting to be discovered. And today, with its each and every delight revealed for the world to see, Moscow is undeniably one of the most captivating destinations in Europe.